in Boeing in the late 90s when they realized that this startup over in Europe called Airbus was actually now selling more planes than they were. Yes. And they were going through a lot of difficulties. But one of their recent triumphs was the 777 aeroplane. And the man who'd run that, Phil Condit, had become the CEO. And he'd put together the whole project of the 777 by breaking down all of these barriers and creating these new conversations. And the 777 was the first aeroplane that they built in this new way. And actually, it was really quite remarkable, and they've actually never been able to recapitulate the spirit or the chemistry that they had since that time. So Phil Condit's trying to bring in this new dispensation, which is all around what I would call conversational leadership. And they put together this year-long course for all 600 leaders to go through. Any organization that has 600 leaders is already in deep trouble. As far as I can say. And so there's going to be 60 a month for 13 months, you know. And I come in and I'm to be there for 3 days running a thread through this week. And immediately it's apparent that there's a huge faction of nobles, you know, in the drama who want nothing to do with this. And they're part of the no conversation, just do it, you know, the whole military hierarchy that Boeing came out of from the Second World War. And one of the fascinating dynamics at Boeing was this dynamic of public humiliation, where people who came up with ideas that didn't quite work or weren't approved would be humiliated literally in front of everyone else in a kind of ancient military fashion. But then they would be mercifully forgiven, you know. The arm would be put around, there'd be a laugh and all the rest. And it would all be forgotten about as long as they remembered why they'd been humiliated in the first place. So this was a big dynamic. And so I was in there, and Phil Condit was, and the conversational faction was standing behind this way forward. But there was this recalcitrant group, and they were very powerful. And they were headed by the head of global production and the head of the fighter jet division, which was really appropriate. Yes, these strafing runs, you know, and it all came to a head about 3 months into it. And when the head of the fighter jet division and the head of global production were in the same room as Phil Condit, and he was putting himself through this week, and he very bravely put himself in the same week that the leaders of the opposing faction were in. And it all comes to a head with my talk that morning, because I'm the representation, you know, the pure single malt representation of this erroneous direction. And so I walk in there, and the public humiliation starts, and it starts with this line of guys at the front, all with their newspapers up like this. So there's 60 people in, but there's about 7 or 8, you know, including the head of global production and the head of the fighter jet division, and the papers are up like this. And so step 101 in humiliation. And so I start with the theme, which is all about people hiding behind barriers, refusing to come out, you know, marriages that die while the man's reading the newspaper and things like that. Rilke, the great German-speaking poet, you know, these fortified cities, and slowly, you know, as I'm working with this, you can see one guy even had the newspaper upside down. He wasn't even, you know, it was just like this. You know. But slowly the newspapers come down. And then there's just 2, and it's the last 2 guys, the big honchos, you know, and they're there. And finally, about 15 minutes from the end, the head of global production's paper comes down, you know, and he has to look at me, and everyone looks at him and pretends they're not looking at him, and then there's the last newspaper, and the whole tension in the room is whether this newspaper will come down or not, you know. And so I'm working even more. I'm only giving my talk to this one guy in the room behind this. And finally, literally 5 minutes from the end, the paper comes down, you know, like you hear it, yeah, with a crack. And then everyone breathes a sigh of relief. And then the talk ends, and then everyone stands up to go to lunch, and they're putting their papers in their briefcases and all the rest, yeah. But this guy stands up. I walk over to him, and I said, I said, you shouldn't be wasting your time here, because this is voluntary. And Phil said, if you don't want to be here, don't be here. Do something else. So why do you want to be here? You should, actually go and do something useful. Build your organization. And he turned in a really loud voice. He said, you're a crock of shit. He said like that in front of 60 people. Everyone. It's like high noon. And I said to myself, I just had a moment there, because it's one of those moments of truth. You've no time at all. But part of me said, do I finesse this? Yeah. You didn't hear it. But I had behind me, I felt my Uncle John and my O'Sullivan Irish boxing relatives, and they were all saying, go at him, because here was this concentrated dynamic that was killing the organization, this public humiliation. And I also thought this beforehand, that other people here, they had their livelihoods, their families, the whole thing. I could be employed by anyone else. I didn't need this. I didn't ultimately need it. If I couldn't say it, no one else in this room could, because I wasn't held hostage the way that other people were, having to provide for their families. And so he said, call me a crock of shit, and then he turned to go. I said, wait. I said, you can't leave. And then everyone's listening. And he says, why can't I leave? I said, you insulted me. We have a relationship. So I pursued him down the hall, and everyone started throwing their papers in and following him, and we had about 30 people behind, all pretending not to listen, and we're having this big fight which is going down the hallway, and I'm saying, you really ought to not waste your time, and he's saying this and he's saying that, and we all go into the dining hall. And anyway, the next morning he does leave. He goes and talks to Phil, and he says, I am wasting my time here. I don't agree with any of the direction. I'm out of here. So he left. And that was the moment that everyone got behind the course, because something real had happened. Something had actually occurred that was going to push the conversation along. And out of it, I got one of the greatest compliments I've ever had, because the next session, the next month, I came, and the moment I stood up, everyone was really listening, And I sat down afterwards, I said, God, I said, they were right there, right from the beginning. There was no convincing to be done at all. And the fellow said, yeah, have you not heard that what's going round the production lines in Boeing? I said, no. He said, don't fuck with the poet. So I imagine this as a workplace banner over the production line. But it's really with the tradition. I mean, it wasn't just, it was the poetic tradition that I was standing for, which is, it has to be said, yeah? And it was also the tradition, the lineage of the fighting Irish, put to good use. So it was this conversation between the inheritance you have, your best powers, and what's inviting you into the future. Will you take that? Will you take that stand at the crucial moment? So anyway, I'm getting to the poem actually, but so anyway, the guy leaves, and one of the things that the global production manager has done in the non-conversational direction is to tell all of his people that they're going to kill Airbus. And how are they going to kill Airbus? They're going to do it by changing this bespoke crafted aircraft, each one so different, into a commodity. And they're going to double production, and they're going to knock the price right down, and they're going to knock Airbus out. And he gave this big, famous speech, actually, with everyone, hundreds and hundreds of people there, managers and engineers, and said, we're going to kill Airbus by doing this. And then he said, you're either with us or you're against us. And I always think when you say in an organization you're going to kill the opposition, you immediately create distrust in your own organization. Why? Because the person says, oh, they're the enemy now and you're going to kill them. Things only have to shift a little bit. I'll be the enemy and you want to kill me. So I'm going to be really cagey around you. Besides the well-known fact that whoever you identify as your enemy, you stick to like a tar baby. But your real enemy is in a little garage, on the outskirts of Santa Fe, with no money behind it at all, someone creating a disruptive technology. That's the real future. So he, against the wishes of the people who are actually working on the line, who said the systems were at their edges and planes were having to be worked on that had red tags hanging off them saying it should have been done earlier down the line at half the cost. He pushed the whole system and he broke it. And 6 to 9 months later, 3 of the major lines in the Puget Sound broke down completely. And they had to stop aircraft production for 3 months. This was in the 90s. It made all the newspapers. I was part of the whole thing, so and Boeing lost something like $7.5 billion through this gentleman's non-conversational approach. And then, of course, it was public, it was out, and he was out. And so in the next year, a year later, I'm in a Starbucks in Seattle. And I'm sat by the door having my triple dry cappuccino. And in walks this fellow, the head of global production. And funnily enough, we'd actually had good personal chemistry together. But we were on opposite sides of the lines when it came to the whole future conversation in Boeing. And he walked up to the counter. I thought, my God, this is going to be interesting, because when he turns around, he can't do anything but see me. And he will either pretend he hasn't seen me, which will take a lot of effort, or there will something else happen. And I was just interested in what had happened to him, what he was doing. And of course, he'd got the gold in a handshake at that level in the organization. He'd got millions. He could have gone anywhere. Disappeared. And the interesting thing was, when he turned around and he saw me, his eyes lit up. And he came over and said, do you have a moment? I said, I do. I'd love to chat. So he sat down. I said, how are you doing? And he said, a lot better than I was 6 months ago. I said, what are you doing there? He said, I've started a consultancy. Really? I said, what's the consultancy doing? He said, I'm helping leaders not to do what I did. And I said, what did you do? He said, I refused, as you would say, he said to me, I refused to have the internal conversation. I said, what was that internal conversation? He said, really, it said it was about my death, because I'm 55. And the interesting dynamic is, when you're in your 50s, you've really reached the height of your competences. You know how the game is played. You know what to say to the right person. You know what to say. And just as you've learned how to do the whole thing, you realize you're going to die. And you don't know how to play that game. When you're 21, someone is going to die, but it's someone you're going to become. When you're 51, you are going to die, and it's very personal. And there's a sneaking suspicion, actually, that the rest of creation could actually be quite relieved to see you go. So you can stop taking up all this oxygen, stop repeating yourself, and make way for something a little more innocent and a little more courageous. So the refusal to have this conversation where you've no competency, to step into that dark wood, means that you'll have all kinds of displacement behavior on the outside to make up for this hole at the center of your world. And that's exactly what he said. He said, because I wouldn't have that conversation, I wanted one last youthful charge at the enemy lines. I was going to do what I'd done all my life in my 20s and my 30s in the same way, which is just push through, break through. And I was so impressed with the fellow, because as I said, he would have had millions. He could have disappeared into some gated golf community, and never been seen by society again. And he was picking himself up, and with a really robust vulnerability, he was stepping forward. And I went home and I said, this is really fascinating. This fellow's got something that the head of the fighter jet division didn't have, because he just disappeared, and he disappeared with a snarl. And I said, what is it that this gentleman has that the other and many people don't have. I said it's some kind of ground of experience that you return to that enables you to have integrity, that enables you to risk yourself, not just for yourself, but for others. And I was saying to myself, what were the experiences you had, David, in your life that enabled you to negotiate really crucial, courageous conversations in your life? And I went back and I thought, well, you know, when I thought about the Boeing thing, I thought, well, that was my Irish O'Sullivan inheritance, my Uncle John teaching me how to box, you know, when I was little, but in a really wonderful way, you know, a really kind of merciful, compassionate way. And he taught me when it was appropriate to do it and when it was not, you know, that it was a kind of ritual way of being in the world. And then I thought of my having seen Jacques Cousteau sail across our little television set. That was a seminal moment in my life, the great French marine zoologist. It made me give up all my art subjects and put myself into the road to Galapagos, biology, chemistry, and physics. And I said, well, you know those, go back further, you know. And then I thought of this stone wall where I'd sit over the fields and look out at the moors to the west as I grew up. And I used to go out there by myself and sit on that wall. And that was my dialogue with the future. That was another foundational place. And I said, go back further now and find something that you haven't thought of, you know, that's new to you. And I suddenly saw myself reading this book that I'd been given for Christmas one year when I was 7 or 8 years old. And it was a book of Native American stories, or Indian stories as we called them then. And I was so taken by this book. It was a large format book. It was beautifully illustrated. And it had a gorgeous aroma. When you're a child, you're really aware of smells. And I remember the smell of this book, actually. And little did I know, you know, that I would make my home in North America years later. But I was fascinated by these stories. And one of the stories was very similar to The Boy Lost in the Forest, which was a child, a young boy, being taught by an elder how to cross a piece of broken ground in the forest. And it was, the elder was standing there with a cloak around his shoulder, great dignity. The boy was on his knees, taking off his moccasins. And behind the boy was this tunnel of leaves and twigs that he was going to cross without making a sound. And I was so fascinated by this story, I almost wore the ink off the page with looking at it. And if you let that book fall open, it would have fallen open to that story. And then I'd go out and practice my non-existent Native American skills amongst my friends. I was probably sounded like a mastodon coming through the woods, but to me, I was that silent, you know, flitting figure. And I said, my God, why were you drawn to that story again and again and again? What was it that was germane to your conversation? And another really beautiful question to ask yourself is, what have been recurring themes in my life? There are clues as to how I hold the conversation of life. Will I actually embody that experience, not see it as a kind of eccentricity, but actually bring out the essence of my qualities that are shown by just the way I pay attention, just the way I look at them. And if you have a child and they're drawn to a thing again and again, it's so lovely to feed it because it's some iconic representation of the way they're made in the world. Yeah. So I sat there at my desk and I said, what was it? I said, I'll write a piece to get to the bottom of it. And this is it. Actually, I haven't recited it for months, so I think I've got it in my memory. But luckily, we do print them up now and again, and it's in there. I might have to go and get it, but I think I have it. And it's called Sometimes. Yeah. Sometimes, if you move carefully through the forest, breathing like the ones in the old stories, who could cross a shimmering bed of leaves without a sound, you come to a place whose only task is to trouble you with tiny but frightening requests, conceived out of nowhere, but in this place beginning to lead everywhere. Sometimes, if you move carefully through the forest, breathing like the ones in the old stories who could cross a shimmering bed of leaves without a sound, you come to the place whose only task is to trouble you with tiny but frightening requests. Requests to stop what you are doing right now and to stop what you are becoming while you do it. Questions that can make or unmake a life. Questions that have patiently waited for you. questions that have no right to go away. Sometimes, if you move carefully through the forest, breathing like the ones in the old stories who could cross a shimmering bed of leaves without a sound, you come to the place whose only task is to trouble you with tiny but frightening requests, conceived out of nowhere, but in this place beginning to lead everywhere. Requests to stop what you are doing right now, and to stop what you are becoming while you do it. Questions that can make or unmake a life. Questions that have patiently waited for you. Questions that have no right to go away. When I wrote that last line, I realized, one of the ways I held the conversation of life, and especially through poetry, my work was to work with the questions that have no right to go away in a human life. Why do they have no right to go away? Because you can turn your face away from them, and when you turn it back, it's still there. It's the gateway to the next stretch of territory in your life. And you think about these questions that have no right to go away, they're in every marriage and relationship. And the couple can both turn their face away from the question, actually. But when they do that, everything goes into neutral. Everything goes out of gear. Everything becomes abstract until the couple turn their face back to the question. You have questions in a work team that have no right to go away. You can hope that you can get by without addressing them. Yes. Collectively turn your face away. Let's not look at that right now, please. Yeah? Can we just get on and get some work done? Eventually, you turn your face back to it. The interesting thing in the workplace is you don't have to solve the question. All you've got to do is turn your face back to it, and immediately everything starts to become real again. The doorknobs are real, the telephone's real, your colleagues are more real, and your customers are more real again. And you haven't even solved the question. All you've done is turn your face back to it, because that's the Dantean ground. That's where you need to step.